Welcome to Finance Unfiltered from the team at Yellow Finch Financial. We're here to help you build your financial nest, whether you're figuring out a budget or planning for the big stuff. Skip the jargon and ditch the suits. Just real talk, honest takes, and a little bit of fun while we figure out money together.
Welcome back, everyone, to Finance Unfiltered. This is our third episode. I am, once again, for better or for worse, your host, John Lawrence. With me today is Previn Pandey. He's just recently passed the CFA Level 2 exam, so he works with Wes on our investment team.
Yep.
Been with us, 2-3 years now?
It's been over 2 years.
That's crazy.
As of August.
That's crazy.
Time flies.
Yeah. But we're here today to talk a little bit about, how do we understand economic data? We see headlines out there all the time of like unemployment's here or inflation is there. And, if you just read the headlines, like, okay, that's cool, but what does any of this actually mean? So, I just want to give some people some knowledge so that when they see these headlines, they can kind of really understand them and interpret them and have a better understanding of what's going on around them. So, in general, when we look at economic data, what do you want people to take away from it? How do we kind of interpret this stuff when we're looking at it internally?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I would just preempt this whole conversation by saying, I actually started out in the industry as a data analyst. And so one of my first jobs was actually pulling a lot of these obscure economic data points that you probably hear in the news all the time. And, if I look back to who I was then, I just really wish I had, somebody there with me to kind of walk me through how to make sense of all this data. And so I think if there's any one takeaway I would want the viewers to have from this podcast, it would certainly be, to make sense and kind of demystify some of these economic data points. And so that being said, I would just say when it really comes to interpreting economic data, really the biggest mistake people make is focusing on a single number in isolation. And keep in mind that one data point really doesn't tell a story. Trends really do. Think of it kind of like checking the weather, for instance. One hot day doesn't necessarily mean we're in a heat wave, and one cool day doesn't necessarily mean summer's over, right? Yeah. Same logic applies to economic data. What really matters is the direction and the pattern in that data over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of the data we look at, like GDP or inflation, they come out monthly. Some stuff comes out quarterly.
Yep.
GDP also, they kind of look year over year. But like you said, it's where were we last month, 3 months ago, 12 months ago, whatever, versus where are we today? And then the other question that always comes up with any kind of data or anything, obviously, is forecasts.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime they put out, here's where GDP is today, and then we're forecasting for quarter four, it's going to be there. And the other thing I think that people don't realize a lot is when it comes to market movement, I think a lot of this movement, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of it is often based on, if they expected GDP to be 3% growth and it ends up at 2.8%, then with, like you said, the trend being lower than what we were expecting, that can really throw a wrench in things, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Another big part of interpreting data is forecast versus reality. Before every major data release, like jobs numbers, inflation, GDP, and the like, economists put out their expectations. This is also known as consensus data. The market reacts not just to what the data is itself in isolation, but it reacts to whether or not it was better or worse than expectations or consensus. For example, let's say inflation comes in lower than forecast. Markets might tend to rally as lower inflation tends to be good news for stocks and bonds. And obviously the opposite is true. If inflation surprises to the upside, investors might need to brace for a sustained level of higher prices.
Absolutely. So we've kind of, mentioned a few of these data points here, and we really want to focus in on four. First and foremost, talking about unemployment rate, jobless claims, things like that, talking about the labor markets. We're also going to cover consumer price index, CPI, which is kind of what we use for inflation. GDP, we've mentioned a couple of times now, is gross domestic product, so how much stuff we make. And then consumer sentiment, which is kind of a more amorphous, how are people feeling sort of measurement, but very important as well. But let's start with, like I said, unemployment rate, jobless claims. What do we look at when we're seeing that? Where are we getting that data? What are we looking for the job market?
All really good questions. So, we're kind of cheating here because the unemployment rate and jobless claims, they're really two different economic data points, but they're also two sides of the same coin. So we can go into both individually and then maybe talk about how they're related.
Yeah.
So the unemployment rate measures the percentage of people in the labor force who are actively looking for work but simply can't find a job. It's really the most widely cited indicator of labor market health. And you'll pretty much hear this in every monthly jobs report. Now, where does it come from? Another good question. Well, it's produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, part of the U.S. Department of Labor. The BLS essentially collects 60,000 households, 60,000 household data points in a survey called the Current Population Survey. And now, once they have a large enough sample size from this data, they can essentially provide an unemployment estimate.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, all these economic data points essentially are estimates.
Yeah.
Now, the unemployment rate itself is a pretty simple calculation. So once they have the data, you can do it. It's basically unemployed people divided by the labor force. And the labor force is essentially the number of people that are employed versus the number of people that are unemployed. So to give you guys an example, and this is just purely an example, let's say that there's 6 million people that are unemployed and there's 160 million people in the labor force. So 6 divided by 160, that's going to be an unemployment rate of around 3.75%. So pretty easy to calculate. Now, why is it useful? Well, not only can the unemployment rate be used as a gauge for overall health of the labor market, but it also has implications for policy decisions, for determining the path of wages and inflation, and it can even be used as a recession indicator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We can go into jobless claims if you want.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, jobless claims are kind of the different side of the same coin. You know, instead of looking at just the unemployment rate and the rate of people who don't have jobs, they go out and try and get a broader estimate of how many people are without employment right now and looking for jobs, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So jobless claims, otherwise known as unemployment insurance claims, they essentially measure how many people are filing for unemployment benefits. Unlike the unemployment rate, which is monthly and survey-based, jobless claims are released weekly, and they come directly from actual filings, not surveys, and that's another key point to realize. Now, there's two main types of jobless claims. One is going to be your initial jobless claims, so that's new applications for unemployment benefits. This really shows how many people were recently laid off. And then the second one's going to be your continuing claims, which are people who remain unemployed with unemployment benefits week after week, and that's going to be a gauge of how long unemployment is essentially lasting.
Yeah. In jobless claims, you mentioned, we can use this as a recession indicator. It's also something that we've really been keeping an eye on recently with AI being in the news a lot. We're looking at initial new jobless claims and saying, well, is there a trend here that we can look at and say, are these jobs being replaced by AI? Is this what's potentially causing an increase in initial jobless claims? So the other part of that too is, we look at initial jobless claims. We also look kind of the other side of the table and we look at job openings. We look out and people will do surveys and research to see how many open jobs there are. And that's a trend that people will look at and see, well, how many people are out there looking for jobs and filing jobless claims versus how many jobs are actually available in the market.
Absolutely, and both of those data points are pretty much essential to follow. Another one I'd throw in there just for good measure is the non-farm payroll gains, which we've seen more recently take a pretty dramatic downturn.
Yeah.
So obviously there's implications for the labor market, and this is something that key economic policymakers, the Federal Reserve, and market participants are currently watching very closely.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the other thing that people are really keeping an eye on right now is inflation. It's kind of been in the news for 4 years now, 5 years?
Oh yes,
seems like.
Oh yes.
And we measure that with the CPI, which obviously, like you said earlier, these are all estimates. We try to do the best we can. And CPI, it measures a fixed basket of goods, and it basically tries to track and say, have these prices gone up, down, sideways? And there's a lot of different parts to it, and we kind of have to aggregate all that together to get to the one number that people look at, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, it's probably one of the most talked about numbers these days, just given everything going on with tariffs, which we certainly don't have to get into today. It's really the most widely used inflation indicator in the U.S., and it's really measuring how much prices are rising over time based on a fixed basket of goods and services, like you said. Fun fact for you guys here, so the CPI has actually been calculated since 1913, so it's one of the oldest economic indicators that we have in the U.S., and it's not perfect, but it certainly does give us a good sense of how much more expensive life in general is getting. The key questions that it helps answer are prices going up faster or slower than before? And is life getting more or less expensive for consumers over time?
Yeah. I'm sure Cassandra can put up a nice graphic here and show all the different parts that go into the CPI. There are also two numbers that people look at a lot of the times. They'll say core CPI or non-core CPI. There's arguments either way to use either one. Really what matters more than anything is that you're comparing apples to apples. You know, if you're saying that core CPI was up 2.8% last month and it's 2.9 this month, you want to make sure that you're using the same ones and you're not comparing core to non-core.
Absolutely. That's another really good point. And so when you see CPI being released, there's two numbers that you have to pay attention to. One is going to be that headline CPI number, which John alluded to. That's going to be all urban consumers, so that's 93% of the population, and that's going to be the standard figure you see reported. But economists like to look under the hood. They want to really know what underlying inflation is like. And so what happens is they also release a core CPI number, which strips out volatile prices such as food and energy. And this is used by economists to really assess underlying inflation trends over time. And it kind of smooths out the data. And that's really the whole point behind looking at both numbers. So you want to look at both numbers, and it's certainly not right, like John said, to compare a core number to a headline number, but you can look at those two data points separately over time to see how inflation is shaping the overall economic landscape.
Yeah. And like that you pointed out, you know, the whole reason we do that is just to smooth things out over time. Going back to jobless claims or unemployment, people always say, well, why do they do non-farm payroll? It's like, well, a lot of this is just seasonal changes in farmers. You get a lot of new hires during, you know, planting and harvesting time, and then it falls off over the summer. Same thing with energy prices. Like you said, gasoline is almost always higher in the summer and then lower in the winter. So sometimes we'll just strip those numbers out and say, let's just try to get a smoother graph. Doesn't mean it's any better or worse. It's just different.
Absolutely. There's seasonality behind energy prices, also geopolitical risks behind energy prices that really tend to hijack that number and can make a headline CPI figure look a lot more volatile than it really is.
Absolutely. So I think our third talking point here is going to be GDP, which is gross domestic product. Something that we see more on a year-over-year basis. I think the numbers come out quarterly, but it's a longer-term trend, and that's really a longer-term trend because this is something that tries to measure everything that's made in the United States. And it's important, you know, there's GDP, gross domestic product, versus GNP.
Right.
Gross national product. GDP is everything made in the United States borders. So, for example, Honda's a Japanese company, but if they're making it here in the United States, that gets included in GDP. GNP is gross national products, everything only made by American companies.
Yep.
So Apple phones made over in Asia would get counted in GNP, but not a Honda car made here in the United States.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So, you know, how do we use that? How are we interpreting that? Where are we getting that data from?
Yeah, another really great question. So as John alluded to, GDP or gross domestic product, it's really going to measure the total value of goods and services produced within the U.S. borders, right? So, and this is regardless of who owns the company. So another example would be, you know, Toyota making cars out in Detroit. Well, that's still going to be counted in our GDP. It's essentially the broadest measure of economic activity that we have, showing how much output or how much income a nation generates, right? And GDP growth is actually broken down into 6 categories. Consumption makes up about 2/3 of GDP, which makes it the largest component. However, investment spending, state and local government spending, federal government spending, housing, they all comprise GDP as well.
Yeah. And it's important, you know, a lot of people will look at GDP and, you know, there was a textbook definition at one point where 2 negative quarters of GDP was the definition of a recession.
Right.
In reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. I forget the name of the exact government agency that declares recessions or not. But
I believe it's the BEA.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's a part of it, but there's a larger overall trend, whether we can say we're in a recession or not. But it's still a good indicator of, hey, are things going well? Are they going poorly? Especially if we have 2, 3, 4 quarters of negative GDP growth, that's a sign, obviously, things are not going well.
Absolutely, yes. I would also note that, you can think of GDP like an economy scorecard. When GDP is growing, the economy is expanding, businesses are producing more, hiring increases, and incomes rise. However, when GDP slows down or turns negative, the opposite occurs, right? It often signals slower growth. It could mean layoffs or even a recession, like John alluded to. Now, keep in mind, I think an old school definition of recession was, 2 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction, excuse me. However, that's a really old school definition. And, in a post-COVID environment, we have what you call rolling recessions, where there's really sectors that are doing much better than others. And we really don't have a traditional contraction in the sense where you'd see GDP contract, meaningfully for 2 or more consecutive quarters. So it's really looking at more data than that. And so the BEA, or the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they're the ones that actually make that recession call. And oftentimes you really can't make the recession call while you're in a recession until after the fact. And so they're the ones that will declare official recessions after the fact, but really tough to discern whether or not you're in a recession when you're actually going through it.
Yeah. I think we could all tell things weren't exactly great in 2008, but I think it took them until 2010 or 2011 before they actually officially said,
declared
we were in a recession back then.
That's right.
It just takes time. Well, last but not least, we want to talk a little bit about consumer sentiment, which, like I said earlier, it's kind of a more amorphous idea than hard data. It's, any kind of time you require or you're looking at survey results, it's going to be a little harder to pin down. But
that's right.
In general, it's people going out and asking the general population, how are you feeling about your job, the stock market, the economy overall, and giving it a score of, from 1 to 100, what's the pulse of the general consumer, if you will?
Yeah, consumer sentiment, it's kind of a fun indicator because it really has to do with market psychology more than anything else. It's essentially a poll asking people how they feel about the economy. Consumer sentiment measures how optimistic or how pessimistic households feel about their personal finances, the current state of the economy, and future economic conditions. So when sentiment is low, it usually means people are pessimistic, and historically that's actually been when markets perform well on a forward-looking basis. However, on the reciprocal, when everyone feels great, that can oftentimes signal that we're near a market top on a forward-looking basis. So a good example of how psychology really ties into economic data. And like I said, it's really viewed as more of a contrarian indicator, particularly at extremes.
Yeah. So I think, during COVID, it was down in the mid-30s, maybe high 40s. And of course,
yes.
2020, we saw some spectacular market returns, and then everyone was feeling good. We had a couple of good years there, and then 2022, consumer sentiment was very high, and it was a terrible year in the stock market. So.
Exactly. Yep. In 2022, inflation was double digits, and consumers were really pulling back on spending, and so you saw consumer sentiment drop to all-time lows briefly. In general, we look at any reading below 60 as very pessimistic, and any reading at 100, near 100, or even above as very overly optimistic.
Yeah. And it's something we've touched on as we've kind of gone through these. Whenever we look at data points, we talk about whether something is a leading indicator, is what we call a current indicator, or a lagging indicator, which we brought up here. Consumer sentiment, it's contrarian, but it often tends to be a leading indicator of if people aren't feeling very well right now, well, it means things are going to be getting better in the future and vice versa. GDP, we said, at least when you're declaring a recession, that's something that we can't do until well into the future, or things like jobless claims or CPI. Probably are a little bit leading indicators more so than anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And last but not least, we've gone through kind of those 4 major ones. Obviously, there are dozens and dozens of other pieces of data that you can look out there. And it's important to remember that there's never going to be a perfect statistic. There was a really interesting paper I remember reading a little while ago talking about GDP, which was basically saying we're doing the best we can with GDP, but if you try to compare GDP across countries, you can't really do it because things cost different amounts in different countries. Mm-hmm. So if the U.S. and Canada both make 10 McDonald's cheeseburgers, if one's $10 and one's $12, well, GDPs are going to be different, even though they made the same stuff.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, you have to compare apples to apples.
Yeah. Same thing with CPI. We try to look at it and say it's a general measure of inflation, and that's why we have this fixed basket of goods. But you can't go into Walmart and say, well, red bell peppers went up by $0.25 and green bell peppers went up by 21 cents. It's just not possible.
Right, and who wants to track all that data anyway, right? That's
Yeah.
no fun. So, I mean, it's important to remember that no statistic is perfect. CPI can't capture every price change in the real world. GDP does miss a lot of nuance, but what matters is that consistency that you alluded to. If the methodology stays the same, then we can compare today's numbers to the ones we had in the past, and we can see the trends over time. So, another point I would make would be just to be aware of the different data source.
Absolutely.
Different data sources measure different things differently. So, for example, there's a free tool that people can use called the GDP Now model estimate. It's from the Atlanta Fed. And this provides a real-time estimate for GDP based on all available data at any given point in time. There's also something called blue chip consensus, which reflects more of an average forecast from economists over time. And so, again, the important thing to remember is to use one data source to compare against those data points over time rather than to compare apples to oranges and use and mix and match different data sources.
Yeah. Check your sources, people.
Yes, check your sources.
Always
And
make
cite
sure
your
you're
sources.
getting data from a reliable source, that especially if it's something like consumer sentiment where they're going out and polling different people. It's important to go out and make sure that they're polling more than like 4 or 5 people. Or if they're measuring GDP, make sure it's coming from someone like the Fed or someone that has access to enough people to get the right data and get enough of it to be able to give a good, accurate number.
Yep, reputable data matters and comparing apples to apples. So make sure you're using consistent data sources over time and make sure you're looking at trends rather than individual data points. That's really a point I would want to drive home.
Absolutely. Any other last thoughts as far as data, other points you would want to bring up, concerns you have when we look at things people misinterpret?
Yeah, we definitely scratched the surface. There's a lot to unpack with these economic indicators, but I think this gives you a very good general overview of how to use them and what we look for. So I would just really conclude with, interpreting economic data isn't really about memorizing numbers and looking at individual data points, but it's really about seeing the big picture, how those numbers move together over time, how they compare to expectations, like we said, and then most importantly, what they reveal about the economy and where the economy might be headed next.
Absolutely, yeah. Never feel like you need to know all this stuff and never be afraid to ask questions about stuff you don't know, but all of this stuff is public data. It's very easy to find. So if you're ever curious about what something means or what it's looked like over time, what the trends are, go look it up and you can find very good information pretty much anywhere.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Previn, for coming on here. I believe
My pleasure.
We kind of talked a little bit about some of the economic data, and especially when it's regards to inflation and things. One of the big things people are talking about right now is the Federal Reserve and part of their mandate being to keep prices the same. So I believe next episode we're going to be talking more about the Federal Reserve, what they do, what their dual mandate looks like, and things like that. So keep an eye out for that.
Looking forward to it.
And I will be back for episode 4 here before too long. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Certain sections of this commentary may contain forward-looking statements based on reasonable expectations, estimates, projections, and assumptions. Forward-looking statements are not guarantees of future performance and involve certain risks and uncertainties which are difficult to predict. All indices are unmanaged and are not available for direct investment by the public. Past performance is not indicative of future results. This podcast is provided for general information purposes only and does not constitute either tax, legal, or financial advice. Please consult a tax preparer, professional tax advisor, financial advisor, or lawyer regarding your specific circumstances. Investing involves risk, including the loss of principal. No strategy can guarantee any objective or goal will be achieved.